Hey guys, welcome in. Welcome back to the Realist channel. Today it's the very first Historical Monday and we're starting our first series on the war in Afghanistan. Come and learn. Today we're going to talk about the history up to 9/11. It's really important that we understand this history because to have any understanding of where modern day Afghanistan is, you need to learn about how we got to where we are. Afghanistan is completely landlocked and it's bordered by many different nations. So you've got Tajikistan, you've got Uzbekistan, you've got China, you've got Iran, you've got Pakistan. So many different neighbors make for a lot of different issues, particularly when you're talking about fighting a war. Also key to an understanding of Afghanistan is it's a very tribal society. Now this is really different to most Western societies in that Western societies are based on the rule of law, based on shared democratic ideals, whereas in Afghanistan, the power, most of the historical power, lies in your tribe, in your family ties, and your tribal ties. By far the most important tribe is the Pashtun tribe. Now they reside in the south and the east of the country. They make up about 30 or 40% of the total population of Afghanistan, and so they carry a huge amount of power in Afghan politics and Afghan power relations. So in the 70s, the government of Afghanistan grows closer and closer ties with the Soviet Union. Eventually the Communist Party comes into power in Afghanistan, and to make a very long story short, many people in Afghanistan start to rebel against the communist government, and the Soviet Union decides in 1979 that they're going to invade Afghanistan to prop up the communist government. So groups of soldiers, groups of fighters, groups of rebels in Afghanistan start to coalesce and start to fight against the Soviet occupiers. And this is the beginning of the famous mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. Now most of you might think, or most of you might heard that the majority of the mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan who were fighting the Soviet government were overseas Muslims from mostly Arab lands in North Africa, but that's actually not true. The vast majority of mujahideen fighters were Afghan nationals. So a really important part of the mujahideen battle against the Soviet Union is the role that America and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan played in helping the mujahideen fight the Soviet Union. What ends up happening is the US and Saudi Arabia start to funnel weapons and cash into Pakistan, and Pakistan acts as the middleman, transferring the cash and the weapons to Afghanistan, to the mujahideen, and Pakistan takes a lead role in actually training the mujahideen in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. This nexus, this connection between Pakistan and the Afghanistan mujahideen is so important because it's going to play a major role in the Afghan war. So it's during this time that Osama bin Laden, a Saudi national, leaves Saudi Arabia and goes to Afghanistan. While in Afghanistan and Pakistan, his major role was to be sort of a champion of the cause, to be a facilitator, and to be a funder of the movement. So what he does is he uses his connections because his father runs one of the most successful construction businesses in Saudi Arabia. He uses the money and connections to get mostly Arab people into Pakistan and funnel them into Afghanistan, to give them travel papers, to give them weapons, to give them motivation. And so he becomes sort of a champion of the mujahideen cause, and his popularity sort of grows and grows in the Arab world. So while engaged in these activities, Osama actually links up with a notorious jihadi leader, Abdullah Azam, and they form Al-Qaeda, which means the base. So the foundation, the beginnings of Al-Qaeda are actually formed during the Soviet occupation and the Mujahideen fight against the Soviet occupation. So that's why there's this whole myth that the CIA was funding, Al-Qaeda, the CIA formed Al-Qaeda. That's completely wrong. You can ask any national security professional, you can read articles. There is really no link, no direct link between the CIA and the United States government and the formation and the support of Al-Qaeda. So fast forward, the Soviet Union in the late 80s decides Afghanistan is a lost cause. The Soviet Union itself is on the brink of collapse, so they pull out of Afghanistan, but what's left, really important, is a power vacuum. Who ends up filling this power vacuum is the Taliban, led by Mullah Omar, who's a notorious mujahideen fighter. He actually lost an eye fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. So Mullah Omar forms the Taliban. Most of the people who are in the Taliban are Pashtuns or are Arabs or Muslims from around the world who want to establish an Islamic state. And so you've got the Pashtun backbone, which is again the major tribe in Afghanistan, and you've got sort of an international appeal for Muslims to come into Afghanistan to back the Taliban in order to establish an Islamic State. While the Taliban are fighting a civil war and claiming more and more ground in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, they kind of move around the globe. They go from Afghanistan and Pakistan, they move back to Saudi Arabia, they go down to Sudan, and then eventually they make their way back into Afghanistan. By that time, the Taliban had secured, over 90% of the country. There's a little pocket in the north, the Northern Alliance, which become important in the next episode, who kind of resist the Taliban. But the Taliban, for the most part, have control over Afghanistan. So they allow Al-Qaeda to set up terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan is primarily where 9/11 was planned, where it was plotted, where most of the hijackers were trained, and where it was sort of the launch pad into 9/11. And so what do you have post 9/11? You have Al-Qaeda, which is the terrorist group which launched the attacks, based in Afghanistan, protected by the Taliban, which is the national government of Afghanistan. And so the U.S. goes to the Taliban, again, who are the leaders in the country, who are the government of the country, and says, you must hand over Osama bin Laden, you must cut your links with Al-Qaeda and any other terrorist networks. Mullah Omar and the Taliban say, thanks but no thanks, they're our guests, we're bound to protect them with our honor. And so the U.S. invades Afghanistan. So now we get to my favorite part of Historical Mondays, and that is, what is the realist perspective on all this? There's so many things that we could take away, but as a realist, one of the things that I think is the most important, and which has proven to repeat itself time and time again, is this. If you have a country that has a history of having a unified jihadi ideology about fighting and establishing an Islamic State, if that country suddenly experiences a power vacuum, the group that is most likely to fill that power vacuum is the unified jihadi Islamic movement. We saw it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen attempts in Libya to do the same thing. And so a big lesson that we have to take from this episode and going forward is, if there's going to be ungoverned space in places like this around the world, most likely the biggest threat to fill that space is jihadi organizations. So, thanks for tuning in today, guys. If you like what you saw, comment. If you really like it, subscribe and share. And remember, reality always trumps ideology.